basically the principle of successful economic development and continued growth is you want to import raw materials, add value, and export finished goods. So it also
Right.
depends on what you're importing, what you're exporting. So you should import always low value added things, add value, and export high value added things. That way, your terms of trade are going to improve and you're going to be wealthier and wealthier. And that's, of course, what all successful economies have done, whether it's Germany in the past, the US, when it developed in the 19th century, it was a big thing. But then also, of course, Japan, Korea, Taiwan, and China, they've all done this. And to weaken Japan, you would reverse that. And this is what the US policy essentially was. The US was telling Japan, well, you shouldn't do that anymore. And they were citing this neoclassical, slightly fake economics. This is bad. Somehow, if you do that, you should instead not export these finished goods, and you should increase domestic demand. But yes, so basically, any country that wants to stay successful needs to do that. Import raw materials, export highly value-added goods, and then countries can handle a stronger and stronger currency. You see, I mean, Japan's yen has been so extremely weak, which is unusual. It used to have a very strong currency, and that's good for a country because it puts pressure on companies to constantly reinvest and upgrade the technology. Germany was equally stopped in the tracks by the introduction of the ECB, which abolished the German indigenous central bank, Bundesbank, as an independent central bank. And the ECB's policy was just to weaken the currency. And then people were saying, oh, Germany's doing really great, benefiting from this weak currency. Well, no, because that's not the German model. Germany did really well by exporting highly value-added finished goods. The D-Mark, the Deutsche Mark, the former European currency, by market forces, it had become the European currency, strengthening gradually, therefore making it cheaper and cheaper to buy these raw material imports. You see, you add value and you export your highly valued goods that, you can always push up the pricing a little bit because there's such value added. People are willing to pay the premium. And that worked really well. And again, the ECB was the tool, the Brussels and EU tool, to crush this German success story by giving Germany a very weak currency. Then pressure is off. Companies don't have to reinvest. Investment goes down. The value added aspect goes down, and economic growth goes down. Now, that's also what they did Japan in a different way. There's no ECB, external central bank, but the Bank of Japan happens to be the agent for the Federal Reserve and for the US empire to crack open Japan.
Why would Japan and Germany do that to themselves?
Well, because they're not sovereign nations. They've got US troops in the country, and we don't have decision makers that are actually looking after the domestic national interest. They don't exist in power in Germany or in Japan. In Japan, formally on paper, it's a sovereign country, but in reality, because there are US troops in the country, the US does take a great interest in these strategic questions, and pressure is put on prime ministers in the past. And we do also have assassinations. Former Prime Minister Abe died, and far too early. There was an assassination. He would have come back, and he always had this very smart combination of giving the Americans what they asked for. So by the letter, okay, yes, sir, we'll do what you say, but managing the implementation in such a clever way that he would still preserve Japanese national interest. And I think the US side was getting a bit tired of that. He wasn't just a simple-minded executioner for the imperial power like we have now in the German government. I mean, it's basically a kindergarten of government, of people who have no clue and they just do what they're told. But in the German case, the legal situation is actually such that America is much stronger, because the occupation statutes of 1945 have never been completely repealed, and the US has both legal and real actual powers in Germany. There's no peace treaty. The constitution remains suspended. Germany only has this temporary basic law, which was created for the occupation period. Germany is still enemy country in the UN Charter, and the US has the say and uses that power It's very strong military presence, the deep state, CIA bases in Germany, the big military hospitals for all the warfare in the Middle East, the drone piloting, that's all happening from the German, the American bases in Germany. The deep state loves it because what they're doing there, they claim is legal because they've got the occupation statutes under which they can do whatever they want in Germany.
This is quite dystopian, actually. It's kind of a showcasing of if you're a good country and you do what we say, you do what the empire says, then you'll be okay. You'll be like Germany and Japan. But if you don't do what we say, then you're going to end up like Libya. You're going to end up like Venezuela. You're going to end up like, any of these other places. So there's the examples, and maybe because of course, then one would ask, well, why would Japan and Germany go along with that? Like, what is it? You say, well, the U.S. is there, U.S. is controlling them. So they're still at the behest, and they don't want to turn out like these other countries that have been devastated
Well,
by U.S.
but
policies
well,
to crush them.
But of course, Henry Kissinger also gave a warning, which was quite realistic. He famously said that it's bad to be America's enemy. So these are the real, basket cases that were turned into basket cases, like Libya, formerly the most wealthy country, well-off country, standard of living the highest in the whole of Africa, but is now a complete basket case thanks to
Yeah.
U.S. NATO bombing and intervention. So yes, that part we see it's bad to be America's enemy, but he also said it's worse to be America's ally. I think he said it's fatal to be America's ally, and of course that's the irony of his saying that it's even worse if you're not America's enemy, but you're the ally, because the U.S. cannibalizes and exploits its allies, and this has been
Yeah.
happening. Actually, you can go back and we've talked a bit about inflation. You can go back half a century to the 70s, the earlier period where we had high inflation. That was actually such a visible case where the U.S. was um, taking advantage of Germany and Japan to back its own role, to back the dollar. And there was a huge transfer of wealth from Germany and Japan to the US at the time, in this mechanism, which was triggered by the dollar going off the Bretton Woods fixed exchange rate system and the fixed exchange rate into gold, and so the dollar fell, and then the idea was, okay, what can we do to anchor the dollar? How can we back it up? And what the US then did was, number one, it used its influence over the central banks in Germany and Japan, also other countries, UK, and so on. First of all, to tell them, you guys print money now. Because exchange rate is always relative. And if you debauch the yen, if you debauch the dollar, that means by definition you're helping if you debauch the D-mark and the yen, these European and Asian currencies, you are helping the dollar. And that was the goal. That's why we had this inflation in Europe and in Asia. It was actually the central banks, again, just like after 2020, the 21-22 inflation, central bank created. And then secondly, they introduced this new anchor, the petrodollar. And that again arranged for a huge transfer of wealth, mainly from the successful exporting and industrialized countries, Japan and Germany, to the US, because the idea was, okay, they're not buying enough from us. It's from the American viewpoint. They've got huge trade surpluses with us. We're buying their stuff. They don't buy enough of our stuff. What can we do? What do they need? Well, they need energy. So then American military went to Saudi Arabia. Kissinger went to Saudi Arabia, and they forged this deal that Saudi Arabia, the biggest oil exporter, would only sell the oil against the US dollar. And secondly, and this was for a long time secret, Saudi Arabia would then, of course, get all these huge oil revenues. The deal was that 80% would have to be invested in US treasuries. And that was what supported the US Treasury market, the US dollar, and solved this twin deficit problem, the budget deficit and the current account deficit in one stroke. So it was quite a clever scheme. But of course, it had, until this day, it has had huge repercussions, political repercussions. The whole Middle Eastern situation is, powder keg because of this, what was set in motion in the 70s with this
Right.
petrodollar. And of course, because then the oil price rise was arranged after all that, and it was an American decision. Now we've got this deal with Saudi Arabia. Now we're gonna quadruple the oil price. And Saudi
Hmm.
Arabia was forced to do that against its will, as it turned out. They didn't really want to do that, and they felt guilty. We don't want to rip off all these other countries. It was an American policy, and that was not the reason for the inflation. That came earlier. It was the central bank money printing. You look at the timing, and the quadrupling of the of the oil price was in January '74. Inflation had already peaked in many countries in mid '73. You see this first bout of what we call uh, the oil price shock inflation was actually
Right.
before the oil price shock.
I want to get into the petrodollar. You actually wrote about this on your Substack, the end of the petrodollar, the true story. It says, yes, there was a secret deal with Saudi Arabia. Yes, China and BRICS alternatives back end. But the true story is one of intrigues and double crosses and dead bodies. I want to get into that. I just want to wrap up a little bit about all of these
Yes,
vassal states that the United States has. So
yes,
you've got that this kind of makes more sense as to why Japan would have this artificial slow recession for so long, and now they're kind of like, oh, okay, we have to raise the interest rates, uh, and so now so I could kind of understand now what happened this week. And it's interesting about Germany also operating as a vassal state. We don't really ever think of these countries in that way. We're always focused on the countries that are heavily sanctioned by the US, where we see the actual ramifications of being an enemy to the United States rather than operating as the loyal, minion that you're supposed to be. Don't you
yes,
understand? You little. Uh, so this now makes sense as to why even when the Nordstream pipeline was blown up, it
exactly.
makes sense why Germany did nothing about it. That was clearly not only a sign. They weren't signaling just to Russia, but they were also signaling to Germany, which is don't do that. We told you not to
Yeah,
do that. We told you to not try to
exactly,
operate on your own like a sovereign country. What are you thinking? You'll do as we say, and
exactly.
we're going to blow up the stuff. And that obviously was not only an attack against the Russian infrastructure, but against the Germans. And nobody said anything or did anything about it on
Exactly.
the
It was
German
actually
side.
owned by Germany. It's Germany owned, of course, in a deal with Russia, but the pipeline was a German pipeline, and the German companies had put it together, and just recently, just before it was blown up, had finished it actually. These
Yeah,
these four pipelines. One, by the way, survived this terror attack, one of the four pipelines, and Russia has been saying ever since, we're happy to deliver, gas through the fourth one whenever you're ready, Germany. And Germany, of course, says nothing. We don't talk to Russia anymore because they're not
right,
allowed to by America, and they're completely. I mean, the current leadership is just um, scared, and of course, any investigation and who did it is stopped in the tracks. There's nothing
right.
published. They've been investigating for ever since, but nothing's going to happen because everyone knows
Well,
it
who's going
was
to,
Americans'
yeah,
agents, but nobody wants to
right.
say it.
Right. Who's going to say that? Yeah, who's going to point the finger at the United States and say, "Well, it was them that did it." And then what would you even do if that came out? What would any
Well,
country
exactly,
even be
because
able
it's
to do
quite
about that?
extraordinary. Exactly, it's quite extraordinary. It is just evidence that the U.S. attacks its own so-called allies. So it's the
Well,
complete,
nobody's an ally. That's
implementation.
why. Nobody's a
Sorry.
real ally. No one's a real
Well,
ally.
yes,
There's no real allies. It's all
yes,
just minions. You're vassal states. You're
exactly,
you're either a vassal state or you're an enemy, but there's no real because an
yes,
ally signals equality of some type, right?
exactly,
That's what that sort of
exactly.
means, and there is none of that, clearly.
Absolutely, absolutely, and that means that any country that is an ally, a vassal state, will be quite ruthlessly exploited, and that's of course what's been happening to Germany and Japan for a long time already, for the entire post-war era, really.
And I mean, I guess if you're a leader in either of those countries, your options are become Libya and Venezuela, or I guess give in a bit and allow them to control, but have at least prosperity for your people and no
Well,
war or
but
death.
there
And
are other options, I would say. I mean, there is the option now, particularly with these policies driving Russia into the arms of China, and this is really now, taken off that relationship and drawing in more and more countries, all the BRICS countries, Shanghai Cooperation Organization growing, the BRICS countries growing. So, if the Germans had some guts and spine, they would say, okay, we've done it until now, but we're out of there. We're going to join the BRICS countries, or this new alliance as a sort of bloc-free country. It existed in the past. There were during the Cold War. There were the so-called bloc-free countries that were neither in the Eastern Bloc nor in the Western Bloc, and of course the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and the BRICS countries is actually an economic arrangement. It's not a political or military alliance like NATO and its political arm, the EU, and all the vassal state arrangements. So you could say, well, we're just going to be a commercial country, and if the population was, would back that, and then there were bold leaders, it would be possible. But of course, that's where the media comes in, and such opinions have been thoroughly suppressed in Germany. The media control is enormous. In fact, the EU has just stepped up with these draconian media laws, Digital Services Act and the Medium Freedom Act, which are very Orwellian, names. Actually, it's about complete censorship and control. We just had a major German magazine completely closed down, and in the morning dawn raid, and the editor was briefly detained by the police, and the magazine is gone. So that's because they don't want people to realize that actually, hey, we could just stand up and say we're sovereign. Because if it was a big grassroots movement, it would be very difficult for America to then openly be against that, you see, because officially, of course, America, officially none of that exists, and we're all free, everyone is free, and we're for freedom and democracy, right? So if you
Right.
if you enter that level and now say that, okay, on that level, we are now an independent sovereign country, and for our sake of our freedom and democracy, we're now going to just have an independent economic policy. It'd be very hard for America on that level to engage and then actually knock this down. That's why they want to essentially stop any such debate and discussion in the tracks as early as
Yeah.
possible, so that this uprising, grassroots movement never appears. And the media control has been a key instrument in that.
And you guys don't have in Europe at all any sort of First Amendment. Is there any sort of freedom of
Um,
speech, anything that protects you?
Well, there is freedom of opinion exists, but there are, I suppose, there clearly are more restrictions on that than in the US. There have been for a long time various restrictions on that, but it's more disturbingly in Germany has been that since 2020, all these individual freedoms have more or less been steamrolled over by the government, and nothing happens. And the
Mm.
courts, when people put in court cases, rarely, stand up for the fundamental laws and freedom, but mostly the courts seem influenced by the government. State prosecutors are under government instruction, and it looks like more and more judges are. Not all.
Yeah.
There is some hope, but it seems somewhat skewed, and so that is a difficult situation. Yeah.
Hey guys, this was just a clip of a longer show. Catch the full show by going to KimIversonShow.com. It is free. It airs Monday through Friday, 5 p.m. Pacific, 8 p.m. Eastern. You could go back now and watch this full interview. I highly recommend it. Again, go to KimIversonShow.com. Thank you so much for watching.